Hello, friends and fans of LeadIQ, and welcome to B2B Sales Trends to Watch in 2023 featuring Forrester. My name is Millie Brooks. I am the Director of Digital Marketing and Demand Generation here at LeadIQ, and today I've got the pleasure of moderating a discussion about what we can expect from B2B sales space in the coming year. Let's be real to get started. 2022 was a tough year for sales. I remember the collective sentiment that we were excited to get back to a new normal after the pandemic in 2020. And we know that didn't happen in 2021, but we were still hopeful that last year was going to be our year. And I think I'm here to tell you today that abnormal is the new normal. In 2022, businesses had to overcome an economic downturn fueled by inflation, fears of World War III, massive layoffs across the tech industry, and the continued shift to remote first working environments, and Elon Musk buying Twitter. These external factors have made it increasingly difficult for sales teams to hit their quotas. With all that pressure to perform, we felt like it was a great time to connect with our friends at Forrester and have a discussion about what to expect from the future of B2B sales, based both on Forrester research and our collective experience. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can help your team strategize for the coming year. Joining me today, I've got Ben Kwon, our very own COO. Ben has been in the tech industry for the last 20 years, leading successful sales and go-to-market organizations at companies including Sumo Logic, Zuora, SuccessFactors, and Salesforce. We also have a very special guest speaker, Ann Slough, a principal analyst at Forrester. Ann has a rich background directing senior level executives in developing their corporate strategies with a concentration in sales, sales enablement, and sales ops. To get into the segments we're going to cover today, there are three main trends we want to hit on. We will start talking about changes in buyer behavior and the B2B sales journey. Then we'll cover who buyers are today and how that's changed. Transition into the way sales technology is impacting how we sell and how our consumers buy. And we'll wrap hearing Ben and Ann's takes on the values that will shape our industry in the future. So getting into our first segment here on buying behavior, I want to start with a stat that was really powerful to me. We've seen a generational shift with millennials now having a seat at the table in the buying process. Correlating with this change here, 55% of buyer cycle interactions are non-human today. So Ann, I'd love to hear your perspective. This metric here, if half of buying interactions are non-human, does that mean that companies are seeing more of a shift to inbound versus outbound?
Yeah, first of all, Millie, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you and Ben, so I want to say thank you. And then, I think as buyers continue to empower their own buying journey with this ever increasing knowledge that they're collecting at the front end of the buying cycle and their knowledge around the organization's products and solutions and competitive differentiators, I think we're going to continue to see this shift from seller-initiated outreach in this outbound form to more of a buyer-initiated outreach, taking a more inbound sales motion. And I think these inbound contacts will need to be responded to with an increased level of knowledge about what has happened, what's transpired during the buyer journey already. Kind of know thy buyer as your first commandment. And then additionally, I think outbound touches are going to continue to be important, but again, with a more personalized focus.
Yeah, so Ben, if we're seeing this natural shift in the market to inbound, how can outbound teams still make the most out of what they're doing and hit quota?
Yeah, I think hitting quotas probably always has been and always will be a universal concern for sellers, probably at an all-time high for many sellers who have recently entered into the marketplace. And it's interesting to see this shift from buyer-initiated versus seller-initiated. But as Ann mentioned, I completely agree. There will always be an aspect of an outbound outreach to really engage with your potential buyer. I think it's all the more reason why you really need to make sure as a seller that, where do you start? How do you break through the noise and get your buyer's attention? And I think a big part of that is ensuring that your message is valuable and it's relevant. And as Ann mentioned, it's personalized. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to really personalize an outbound message. And unfortunately, most sellers just don't do it because of how much time it takes. The other thing I want to touch on, I like the know thy buyer, is you really have to respect the journey that your buyer wants to go on. I think for so long, we really tried to guide the journey that we want our sellers to go through. However, in some regards, it's almost a sign of disrespect. I feel like your buyer is more informed than ever before. There's a good chance that that buyer initiated some type of engagement, and I think we really need to understand how the buyer wants to engage. These are two areas that we've been very focused on at LeadIQ. How do you enable sellers to hyper personalize at scale so it doesn't take 15 to 20 minutes per outreach? And also, how do you track certain triggers that tell you when a buyer is ready to engage? I think those are two critical elements that we all need to take into consideration and really need to figure out how to do effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, and just a quick comment, Ben. We talk about the buyer aligned sales process. So we talk about understanding the buyer journey first. And that is obviously partnering with organizations internally like portfolio marketing, because, understanding all the interactions, what kind of content, which I think feeds into what LeadIQ does as well, right? Meeting them at the beginning of that process, and then mapping the seller journey to the buyer journey. So it's a buyer aligned sales process. So thank you for calling that out. And we often encourage our clients, and I'm sure you do as well, to understand that buyer aligned process and how buyers want to buy. And we map to that. And 100%, I think traditional sales, we've been very internally focused. What do we want sellers to do? What are the gates in the sales process from a sales perspective without understanding the buyer journey? And it's a good transition, thank you, Millie, to really understanding that buyer journey, because they're doing more due diligence than ever before. So in 2019, when we surveyed buyers, there was an average of 17 interactions during the purchase process. Now there are 27. So 10 more steps or 10 more interactions in the buyer process. So it's elongating that buyer process. And then, Ben, from your perspective or your experience, how do you see that sales teams can really combat these longer purchase timeframes and more clutter around the buyer consideration?
This is a really interesting stat that you shared with me prior to this. And I think naturally your sales organization wants to shorten the process and shorten the sales cycle. But going back to really understanding how your buyer wants to engage and wants to buy, it's interesting to see that the amount of touches has actually increased. I think all the more reason why, knowing that your buyer is more informed than ever, you really have to do your homework. Your buyer's doing your homework. I think as a seller, you really have to do your homework. In fact, I would encourage everyone, do their homework for them. Why not go ahead and share who are the competitors in your space? This will give you an opportunity to proactively go and express what are the other options, and more importantly, how are you differentiated from the other options? I'm a firm believer in we may not be able to shorten the sales cycle, which may be the initial inclination for many sellers. If we're not able to shorten the sales cycle, let's make sure it's the most effective time used for both yourself and your buyer.
Yeah, and I think also how the time frames are increasing. The stat on the right, and you just touched on it, Ben, from the purchase time frame of 4 months or longer, 19% to now 32%. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, we know that we're selling to a buying group and not just individual buyers. And so the more stakeholders you have in the buying process, the more the buying process is going to get elongated, because now as a seller, you've got to figure out, first of all, who's in the buying group, who are all the stakeholders, what are their roles, what are their drivers, how are they being measured for success? And so it gets a little more complicated, which is going to elongate the process. Also, I think even though buyers are collecting a lot more information at the front end of the sales process, you have to add value and differentiate based on that now. So when you're having that initial conversation, you can't do the traditional band, right? You've got to add additional value or immediately differentiate yourself. And I think, Millie, you had said that around the clutter, get above the noise and the clutter. And so what we know is that the buyer process is episodic. It is not a linear process. And the goal is really to eliminate friction throughout the buying process, because we don't want sales cycle times to get longer, but we do want to understand who's in the buying group and give them what they need to make a faster decision. So if you think about one friction point is exploring the website when we're in the education stage of the buyer process. And I think, Ben, you touched on something really important when you were talking about, we want to guide the buying process. And I remember back in the day, we would actually design websites to make certain information harder to find than other information, right? Because we wanted our buyers to kind of only see what we want them to see and guide them. And that's no longer the case. Buyers will just get frustrated and just leave and disengage if we make it hard on our website. So reduce friction there. Also, if you think about the sales rep, is there friction in the interaction with the sales rep? Can a buyer easily reach out, raise their hand and say, I'm ready to buy now, or I'm ready to have a conversation? Or again, is that sales rep driving it? And then finally, in the selection process, when we're offering a free trial, are we putting so many caveats around that it just becomes a frustrating process, and it's not really a free trial, but it's complex. Again, buyers disengage. So understanding your buyer journey, understanding the buying groups, and also the removing friction throughout that process, I think is really important.
I love this conversation on removing friction and how we can personalize, how we can make every buyer have that white glove service. I think that transitions well into our next segment to not only think about how buying behavior has changed, but what are buyers actually looking for and who those buyers are. So you have both been in the industry for a long time. Ben, I would love to hear your perspective on how buyers have changed in diversity over the time that you've been in sales and in tech.
Sure. So, and first of all, I love that visual, and I love this notion of the sales process actually episodic, not linear. And I completely agree. You're really selling to a buying group. And I think that software sales has long had a reputation of being pretty much predominantly a white male industry. But the buyer has changed. The buying group has changed, right? The buying group has changed in age and gender and ethnicity. And at the end of the day, I firmly believe that people don't buy a technology, they buy a solution. These buying groups are buying a solution. And people buy from people. People want to buy from the people that connect to their pain points and really can articulate and solve their problems with the solution that is relevant to them, right? I just want to comment on a comment that you made around what is the value to each of the individuals in that buying group. I think it's so important that we really understand this as we move into, I think, a year where hyper personalization in so many ways is going to be such a critical element of being successful in software sales.
Yeah, and I think too, Ben, when we talked about almost half of the decision makers or buyers are now millennials. And so what's important to them? Yes, they're digitally native. They've grown up with technology their entire lives. They're used to researching and finding out information before ever engaging with another human being or sales rep. And I wholeheartedly agree that at the end of the day, if all things being equal, buying that person and the relationship, and you want to do business with them. And so having the buyer see themselves in you and that you can relate on some level from an experience perspective, it could be a diversity perspective. They want to see themselves and the person they're partnering with, and also aligning with the values of that organization. And so I think it's important for us to understand that for Ben, you and I, we grew up in a very different kind of sales world. And that world is quickly diminishing. And if we're going to be successful and have a competitive edge, we've got to understand millennials and then coming after them, Generation Z, and what's important to them, because they're very different than their millennial counterparts. And I think that we're not only seeing this generational and ethnic diversity in our buyers, but also a diversity in the roles who make up the buying group. And I thought this was really interesting that really executives, IT, and finance are the most often included in the buying purchase, over 80% in 2021. And C-suite executives have really increased their role as decision makers, especially in the more complex consensus and committee scenarios. And with so many people, a senior leader is needed to make this final decision. That puts back to when we talked about understanding the buying group. As a seller, the worst thing that can happen is you've gone through the entire sales process, and at the very end, here comes a new buyer that you weren't aware of that was sitting in the background, and you didn't uncover that person or their needs and how they're measured. So understanding that as we move into this 2023, where economic headwinds may be even greater. So I'm not wishing that on us, but if that were to happen, understanding finance decision makers, IT decision makers, and executive decision makers is going to be really important, and identifying them early in the sales process and figuring out what success looks like to them.
During some of the trends we've talked about with diversity in sales, I would be really interested to get your perspective on if you have any suggestions for building a more diverse sales team to make sure you're able to hit all of the buyers that are included in buying groups now. I think it's still hard to achieve diversity in sales teams at times, probably due to the stigma that Ben mentioned with the industry. So would love to hear your thoughts on how you achieve that more diverse
Well, Millie,
group.
I get asked this question a lot as it pertains to women, right? So everyone wants to understand, how can we get more women in sales, especially in IT sales? And so could be a whole nother webinar. So I'm going to parking lot that. But I think in general, I think you have to look at non-traditional recruiting places where you're pulling talent from. I tell people all the time, everyone's a salesperson. Everyone is selling. You're selling every day, either your ideas or, you're trying to get someone to agree with you. You're selling every day. And I think we typically look at university level business majors. Well, there are other majors that might lend themselves. I was an English major. Right. So there are other majors that we might go to. I think we should look at not just the degree, but also their experience. I look at hospitality as a great place to find sellers. If you go to a restaurant or you're in retail and someone's delivered great service, that's a seller. That's a salesperson who, may not have a traditional background, but we have to look at new places to recruit sales talent from instead of the traditional kind of thinking business background. So I think that's the first idea, is to think about what are the core competencies we're looking for. Tenacity, curiosity, right? They're comfortable being measured with goals. I had a client one time in another life, and they would always go to athletes for their sales talent because they thought they've been a part of a team. They know how to achieve a goal. They're used to filling a role. They're used to working with a lot of other personalities. So they recruited athletes who may have been philosophy majors, right? So it's looking at how can we broaden our talent pool to bring in that diversity.
I think, and just to comment here, I couldn't agree more. I think this could be a whole session on its own. I read some very interesting and to some extent very alarming stats around, and it was in an article that was really focused and encouraging to explore non-traditional recruiting methods and backgrounds, right? And there was an article that even went down to how your job description for various sales roles are written subconsciously are catering more towards a male audience. It was very interesting, but I do think, as we touched on earlier, buyers are changing, right? And people buy from people. So I think as people continue to explore different recruiting options, it'll help us create diverse perspectives within our sales organization.
Yeah, thank you both for that feedback on diversity. Moving along, we've spoken a lot about the digital landscape and how the digital landscape has been changing our industry. Let's look a little bit at the technology that is influencing how we sell, also how our consumers buy. So Ann, would love to start with you here.
Yeah, so when we were looking at what functions within an organization have already automated at least one business process, I think the usual suspects are at the top, right? You expect IT and finance and supply chain to be at the top. But what was a little concerning for us is that sales and marketing were in that lower quartile, lower half. And I think there are many reasons for that. I think, and we've already touched on some of them actually. We've talked about how we want it to be personalized and unique. And so those kinds of attitudes don't lend themselves to automation necessarily. But what I think sales and marketing could do better is understanding you can have that, but there has to be a standard of selling, right? There has to be a standard sales process. There are many steps that should be automated, especially at the beginning of the sales process around prospecting, sales intelligence, intent, feeding that data to the sales team. So I think sales and marketing, we've told ourselves that we're unique and special and it's all about the human, and that can't be automated. And that's actually not true. I think we want to have nuances and we want to have a personalized experience. on top of the automation and standardization in a sales process. So they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that as sales operations in this space, we love technology because it's the latest bells and whistles. And we all talk about AI and data and insights driven. And so I think that's the fun part of technology. Implementing and adoption are the harder part. So I think sales and marketing needs to do a better job of understanding what is the ideal sales process first, what processes are best practice, what are the sales motions within our sales teams, and then we can automate that and hopefully see this number tick up a little bit more.
Yeah, and that just and I love to get your perspective on this. We have kind of the age-old problem of selling organizations saying, "Hey, there's too many different things I need to learn inside here. You're taking me away from selling. I have to learn 15 different tools in order to do my job." In fact, I read a stat published by Salesforce that was very interesting, saying that sellers now spend less than 30% of their week selling. They spend about 28% of their time selling, and the remainder of the time is inundated in administrative work. 66% of sales reps say they're drowning in tools, but yet 97% of sales leaders say that AI gives their reps more time to sell. So we've got a little bit of this conundrum here of how much is too much. I'm sure you've heard this over time. I certainly have over and over again of a selling organization yelling and screaming that, "Oh, we've got too many tech tools in here. I can't do my job. You're taking away from selling. I have to learn so many different technologies." And then, on the other end saying, "I don't have the tools that I need to succeed." Right. So it's interesting to me that in this chart, sales and marketing is falling behind. And I think this kind of ties into, well, let's take a step back and what is the ideal sales process? What is the ideal sales process from the customer's perspective? And how do we create areas of efficiency and automation in that? Right. I think maybe sometimes technology is fun to buy, and maybe we perhaps get lost in buying technology. And even if it is technology that can create a lot of automation and efficiency, is it really leveraged and utilized in a way that is aligned to the ideal sales process? How do you feel about that? I'm sure you've heard over and over again throughout the years, we have too much, we don't have enough.
Well, I think you're hitting on a very salient key point, Ben, and that's really around the tech stack itself. And most clients that we work with, they have good tech stacks. They have enough. They just don't have good implementation and adoption of their existing tech stack. And so what we know is about 50% of the sellers, if we look at this data, are neutral or don't believe that the sales tech stack really aids in their productivity. And that's what you were touching on. And last year at our summit event, Steve Silver and I actually presented a manifesto on sales technology, how to adopt and increase adoption and usage of your sales tech stack. And there were just 5 quick guiding principles. One, we know sales time is precious, which is what you were hitting on. Only about 25 to 30% of our own data, which aligns with the data you just cited, shows that sellers spend time directly selling and engaging with clients. We also know that clicks really matter. So in the sales tech stack, many of the user interfaces are very complex. There's a lot of clicks. So salespeople feel like, oh my gosh, this is one more tool that I've got to figure out how to marry with all my other tools. We also know data is not insight. So we provide a lot of data to our sellers, but they're overwhelmed with data and they actually don't know what to do with it, or they don't have the skill, the soft skills to implement the insight from the data, which is a whole nother issue. We also have to think about beginning with the end in mind, which is what are your desired outcomes? And Ben, this is what you were just touching on, I think, about the sales process and the sales role. So you have to understand your sales motions and this based on the sales role. And then how do you use technology to enable that? And then finally, we've already touched on this. The 5th principle was around meeting users where they are. And this is around the multi-generational workforce. They're digitally native. And then as you move further back in the generations, we're less digitally native. And I was doing an interview for a summit session when we were preparing, and this was, I thought, really a great way to think about it. One of our clients said, we need technology to bridge the gap between the generations. So we've got these super technologically savvy agents and sales reps, but they don't have the experience and the soft skills and the knowledge of how to sell really effectively. And then we have great sellers who don't know how to leverage technology to help their human skill sets be even more important and enhanced. And I think when technology works best, that's what it does. It bridges the gaps between these different generations and understands the gaps that it needs to enable. So I think those are really the main keys around the tech stack.
That's such an interesting perspective, and reminds me of, some of the sellers that I've worked with that have great sales acumen, run fantastic process run a fantastic sales process from their perspective as well as the buyer's perspective, but are so technology illiterate, right? And then conversely, you have the other side of the house where you have so many sellers who are so strong with all the different sales tech out there. However, they're just not at that level of experience yet where they've really, really developed sales acumen. There's one other thing I want to touch on, which is, what are your thoughts around, there's a tremendous amount of pressure right now, and a lot of it is external market pressure that is leading towards tool consolidation. Right? Tool consolidation as a means for budget management or budget reduction. I think all the more reason why, as sellers or buyers, going back to your point, really got to anchor on what is that ideal sales process, and what do you have in your technology stack that is bridging the gap, that is creating automation and efficiency. But what are your thoughts on how, as sellers, we should look going into next year at this market pressure to consolidate your tech stack?
First of all, I 100% agree with you. I think we're going to see the technology, especially sales tech and marketing technology, actually dating. So we see this blurring of the lines between marketing and the sales tech stack already. We see, marketing technology moving into the further down the funnel and sales wanting to pull data further up from marketing. So we're going to see that convergence continue. We also have been seeing this past year, and I think we're going to see this even more next year, a platform approach. So many of the tech solutions, they started out as best in class at doing one thing. And now they're adding on multiple capabilities to build out a platform. So they're this one-stop shop for your tech needs. And what I would say about that is, and this is what I tell clients, I encourage them to figure out what is kind of their core competency they need. So if they're primarily a net new acquisition, we have to really have a lot of sales intelligence data, outbound, inbound prospecting. We're trying to build these pipelines. We're a startup. We've got to really get a lot of net new. Then you need to look at best in class for that technology, and everything else can be good enough. If you're a more established business and 85 to 90% of your business and you're farming, then you may want to look at other technologies that enhance that sales cycle and those sellers, and thinking about where do you need to be best in class and where is good enough okay. So we're going to see consolidation. We've already seen reduced funding for new startups, technology companies in general, and I think that's going to continue. And then I would say rationalize your tech stack. Look at all the tools you have. Understand your sellers, understand the selling motions that support those sellers, and understand where is your business going to grow next year, and get technologies that enable your strategy and your growth strategy. And that'll help you rationalize your tech stack.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. I think first, really aligning to your company's strategic initiatives, right? Which can and probably will change over time as companies go through their life cycle and their journey, I think is so important. Puts a little more onus on the revenue operations function, which I think historically was very focused on let's buy what's best in class for this specific use case, right? I think it puts a little bit of onus on that function, which could be a whole nother session in itself as well, to really think through that tech stack and how it best aligns to the strategic initiatives you have at that time. The other thing it makes me think about is hearing you say that this shift from best-in-class purchasing, best-in-class solutions, to companies moving more towards a platform play, right? Rather than solving just one problem, moving now towards a platform play. It's with me, it's the bet that LeadIQ has made. We were historically very focused on being best at one part of the prospecting process, and that is helping you identify and capture and integrate into all of your systems of record your buying persona in the most effective and efficient way possible, right? That's how LeadIQ came about. And we have since invested in continuing to create efficiencies in the outbound prospecting process in general. Now moving more in towards a platform where We not only help you identify and capture your buying persona, but we also enable you to see when your buyer is showing various buying signals, as well as I mentioned earlier in the call, helping you cut down that 15 to 20 minutes of research just down to 90 seconds with our patented AI engine Scribe. So it's a good validation to hear from you that companies are moving more from this solving a single pain point to moving more towards a platform.
Yeah, and I would just say for me, I've been a seller and a sales leader for 30 years. All my career has been spent in sales in some capacity. And I think the hardest part of the sales process is the front end, is the prospecting, getting the meeting, having qualified discussions, understanding the personas and the buyers. How does my ideal client profile connect with these personas? What value do I offer? How do I differentiate myself? I think this is the hardest part of the sales process. And so I would just support anything that kind of helps sellers really be more efficient and productive at that end of the process. And the other piece of that or benefit, I think, is this is where burnout really occurs. This is where your sellers get demotivated and disengaged, and burnout really happens. And ideally, you want to use these sellers, the BDRs, this pool of talent to grow your account executives and your account manager pool. So it's got a lot of downstream repercussions when we're not good at the front end of the sales process.
Yeah, that also just conjures up a thought. I don't know how many times I've told a young SDR or BDR who just graduated from college and is entering the workforce, straight from the dorm room to the boardroom, that, well, you're entering technology sales. You're going to start right off the bat with one of the most difficult and hardest parts of sales. You're going to be prospecting. Learn it well, because a good seller will carry those best practices and habits throughout his or her entire career.
Yeah, totally agree.
Right?
Which is maybe
You
go ahead, Millie.
sorry, Ann. Yeah, before we move on, you both gave some really good tips about how to rationalize tech stack and how to think about which tools you should be using if the tool budget is shrinking and you're having a hard time getting sellers to use the tools they have, even though it can help them. I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are on increasing adoption of tools once they're in the stack for our audience.
Yeah, well, I think that's the manifesto that I was kind of walking through, is really understanding the sales role, number one, understanding the sales motions or processes that support that role. And then that's how you have effective design, right? So once you have to understand that first, then you can design a tech stack that has the right GUIs or user interfaces, that has the right information presented for that seller and that sales process. I used to, in another life, I did contact center consulting and I ran contact centers. So it's heavily technology driven. And we always said, 80% of the information that you need should be on one screen. There shouldn't be this constant digging and toggling and clicking and moving back and forth between applications. And in order to do that, the only way you can do that is to understand the sales motion in the seller. So you want to reduce clicks, you want to understand the role, understand the processes. And the other piece that I think is vastly underestimated is the change management and the mindset shift that it takes to get people to adopt new technology. Because we know when you're learning anything new, anything you learn new, you become less productive. There's a period of time where you're learning the new skill or the new technology or platform, and you're less productive. And for most humans, that's really frustrating. We don't like to be unsuccessful. And so you have to support and coach people through that phase. Then they move to adoption. Then you see productivity increase 2 and 3x. But that's the piece that I think many of us gloss over or don't invest the proper resources and time in, is the change management, the mindset change. So people see using this tool is actually going to make me more efficient and better at my job than the old way I was doing something.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice.
And I couldn't agree more on the change management piece. For any seller, they have to make a decision of whether I am going to accept having some downtime or less productive time in the immediate future, because it'll pay off 2 to 3x in the long run, as you mentioned. So I always like to, when I'm evaluating, buying, rolling out any type of technology, I always like to think about what's in it for you, right? What's in it for that seller? How can we really articulate, train, and enable that seller that, yes, by investing your personal time and understanding how to leverage this technology, it'll pay 2-3x, in the long run.
Yeah. Ben, you also mentioned burnout earlier, and I think that's always a really interesting topic for sales leaders to be thinking about and how they shape their teams and make them more successful. Outside of technology, is there any other ways that you help mitigate burnout in the SDR role? Is it still around 18 months? Is that average that you can expect to see someone stay in that role, or maybe remote work has helped that? What are your thoughts?
Specifically focusing on that function, right? It's a function that is near and dear to my heart. For a number of reasons, but one of the primary ones is it's very, very satisfying professionally to see somebody who enters the workforce for the first time and just see them really grow and develop their career and become successful sales professionals, sales leaders in the future. And burnout is probably something that I'm more concerned with now than ever before. I think a big part of this is, I kind of made the joking analogy of coming straight from the dorm room to the boardroom. The reality is they're not even going to a boardroom. They're not going to an office at all, right? So I think, and this is a challenge that burnout, morale for this cohort of sellers, the SDR function where you're coming in, cutting your teeth, really doing a lot of repetitive work. One of the hardest parts of sales day in and day out is a concern. And what I'm seeing in the industry is many companies, ourselves included, right, making an effort to try to create some type of office culture and office environment, right? Whether it's creating some actual physical space that allows them to have a work environment, a couple days a week, or just making a conscious effort to get some people together, either virtually or physically, where you're not necessarily focused on what were your metrics today. What did you accomplish today? What were the numbers you hit? What's your plan for tomorrow, et cetera? But just being able to spend some time with your colleagues, right? And just kind of building up culture and building up the morale.
Yeah, and I'm going to just piggyback on that, Ben, because I think, there's the personal and the professional, that's important. And I do think that especially in this BDR role, because it is so stressful, if we don't feel connected to our team and to our organization, it's much easier to leave. And that's for any role, but especially for this role because of the stress associated with it. And also, I think what I found as a sales leader when we were all together in a room together was there was an energy that was created when someone was successful and everyone knew about it. And it's kind of like the high fives and, go get them. Success begets success. And you start to build this winning culture. And that is contagious. You learn best practices. You may close something and I may turn to Ben and go, how did you do that? Or I heard you say something. Let's talk more about that. And we've lost all of that in the remote world. And there are definite advantages to being remote in the hybrid workplace. But I think there is a culture and a connection that gets created when we're together, especially as sellers, and especially in a very transactional, fast-paced BDR role where you need to see others be successful to motivate you and keep you going and give you that energy. I do think there's a lot of value in trying to figure this remote hybrid workforce out.
2 years later, I think we're still figuring it out. I've spoken to a number of peers, and this is one of the biggest concerns. And one of the biggest concerns is with this group, this cohort of sellers that are typically earlier in their career, and many of which have entered into the workforce during pandemic. How do you create an environment for that natural learning? How do you create an environment where a winning culture is created organically, right? And I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the things you're hearing from
I think,
your peers, your network?
I think from a technology perspective, many of the tech stack providers would say, well, that's what conversational intelligence is for, right? We can listen to each other's calls. We can hear best practices. We can have these collaboration spaces internally where we're sharing wins and chatting with each other and real-time conversations. And I agree with all of that. I think we should use every tool in our toolbox to create this culture and create this connectiveness. And I would say that, frankly, there's some things that you can't replace or technology is not going to solve. And that is the one-to-one human interaction when you and I are in an office space together and we're just chatting about our lives and learning about each other. And that's how we're feeling connected, so that when we need help, we're more likely to reach out. I might say, I met Ben, I know about his family, I feel connected to him. So now I'm struggling. Let me reach out to him and get his advice. Where if I don't have that connection, that personal connection built, I'm just going to sit in my space at home and start clicking on job ads, right? And say, hey, I'm out of here because I don't feel connected. So I wish I had the magic bullet, but it's kind of like when you want to lose 20 pounds and we can give you a training plan and a nutrition plan. But if I don't go to the gym and do it, it's not going to happen. It's kind of like we just have to get into the office and be together. Or maybe as we create monthly get-togethers, we're still remote, but we're all in the same city or same area, and we get together monthly, or we have quarterly touch bases in person, or whatever that cadence looks like that makes sense financially and also for your culture. I think we have to just make that happen, and we we're going to have to find that right balance. But I think we're going to have to be together in person. I think it's hard to replace that.
Yeah. I think, really, as you very well know, we have been hyper focused at LeadIQ in terms of where we've invested and what we've developed in helping sellers connect with their buyers. But, and as you mentioned, I don't think there's any silver bullet in how you help your team connect with each other. I've heard a lot of different creative ideas, from our audience. I would love try anything new creative to help create that energy and that connection amongst your teams.
Yeah, this is
and does Forrester see remote work continuing with all the discussion you've had about that importance of human connection?
I mean, that's a recruiting tool in and of itself, right? To say you can work from home, it's a remote position. 100% remote work is going to continue. I think, especially in the sales world, it's an expectation that you're going to be able to be remote. But like I said, I think we need to move more to this hybrid model. I mean, before the pandemic, actually, there was a trend to bring workers back. You would see some of the larger Silicon Valley organizations start to bring workers back. And then the pandemic hit and that kind of stopped because they could see that.
I think we lost Ann for a moment. Wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't have just one glitch.
So before we lost Ann, Millie, I went through the same thing at my previous company. We went into the pandemic. Everyone was 100% remote. And I think like a lot of companies, a lot of companies tried to go back to being 100% in office, or just try to go back to whatever type of environment they had before. And I think today, and I think one of the areas that Ann was touching on is whether you're 100% remote and or hybrid, that in itself has become somewhat of a recruiting tool. I think there is a tremendous amount of value in starting to create, to the extent possible, depending upon where your teams are located, trying to create a hybrid environment just to help create that culture, that winning culture, and that energy.
Yeah. Ben, for people who have been working remote and have enjoyed working remote, how can you still attract top talent if there are people that have gotten used to that remote atmosphere? How are you thinking about that?
I think, for most functions, I think a big part of that recruiting effort is creating a hybrid environment, right? I think most sales organizations, and probably in the foreseeable future, I don't see, at least any time in my career, us going back to a 100% in office, right? And I know this is probably yet another topic that we can have a webinar on its own. But I think part of it is giving employees, first of all, being very transparent, very candid with your potential candidates, and offering some type of hybrid.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, totally agree with you that I do think we're going to have to find that good balance between connection. We're still having trouble getting Ann to connect, so we will pull her back in and we'll shift over. We are back. And Ann, we wrapped up a good conversation about hybrid versus remote work environment in sales. And now I think it would be good for us to just take a step back and reflect on all of the trends and all of the shifts in the market that we've talked about today, and how our audience can act and when they're thinking about the future of where our industry is going. So would love to hear your take on what to expect from the future of sales.
Yeah. So anyways, my apologies. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. So what we are seeing here at Forrester is really what we're calling the 5 Ps of sales. And you can see on the wheel how we've defined them, but we really think these are going to be the 5 areas or 5 drivers that really shape and impact that buyer line sales process we talked about earlier. And let's start with purpose. What I'd like to do, Ben, if you're okay, is to kind of walk through each one, the definition, and then I'm going to ask you kind of how you're seeing that play out. So if we start with purpose, this is really twofold. One is it's a focus on the capabilities of a company's offerings and how closely that those offerings align with the organization's mission, vision, and values, and how well that aligns with the buyer value. So we know it's, the product offerings, but also the organization's mission, vision, and values, because we know that Generation Y and Z, they want to buy from organizations that align with their value system. So Ben, how are you seeing that play out?
Yeah, I think a big part of this goes back to the comment earlier about our buyers have changed. And I think you had some stat about some significant percentage of the buyers are the millennial generation. And, a lot of the buyers today are when they look at and observing and evaluating various technologies, they're not just looking at the bells and whistles anymore, right? They really want to understand how that company, that solution aligns to their value. And so I think it's, one of the things that, having spent most of my career at startup companies, it's one of the things that I've spent so many hours, so many days, endless hours as a company, really thinking through what is our purpose? What is our vision? What is our mission? What are we trying to solve for? What problem are we trying to solve for our audience today? I can't underemphasize how important that is.
Yeah. And so the next one then is being precise. And this really focuses in today's world, or at least in the last 5 to 10 years, sales reps were really guessing at prospect interest and wasting time on non-qualified buyers. And so where the shift is that now and in the future, ever increasingly, buyers are going to be self-qualifying and sales reps are going to engage with in-market buyers in more meaningful ways. And so I know you're going to have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, this is one of the primary areas, as I mentioned, that the LeadIQ has invested a tremendous amount of time, right? So this is something that resonates very strongly with me, is being precise in your motion, specifically when it comes to LeadIQ, being precise in our outbound motion. Target the right person at the right time with the right message. And that's where we've focused all of our time and energy in terms of our expanded prospecting platform capabilities. So this resonates very much with me. I think it resonates with everyone like myself, like yourself, who have probably received a dozen generic outbound messages just throughout the course of this webinar.
Yeah. Those are my favorites. I would say the third one around being personalized, this is where I'm going to be spending a lot of time in my research, but also I think we've touched on a lot throughout this webinar. And it's really, previously the majority of buyer interactions lacked this contextual continuity. And in the future, what we're going to see is that solutions are going to be co-created through consultative engagements based on our knowledge of the buyer, the buying groups, and what the activities that they've taken up to the point that we engage with them.
And this is, again, another area that resonates very strong with me. I think we're moving into a period of hyper-personalization. And it's one of the things that we are socializing to our customer community is, hey, is your selling organization hyper-personalizing their outreach? And what we mean by hyper-personalizing is, are you engaging with your buyer with a relevant, valuable message that resonates with them at the personal level, at the company level, and at the industry level? I think if you can have that trifecta, which is very, very time consuming to do if you do it manually, I think if you can have that trifecta, you are standing, you are head and shoulders above the rest of your peers or your competitors in the organization by hyper-personalizing your approach to engaging with your buyer.
I think that hyper-personalization then translates into higher productivity, because today we know that sales reps and managers, we talked about this, spend the majority of their time unproductively, preparing for meetings, putting together proposals, internal meetings, emails, travel. We are seeing an uptick in travel actually for face-to-face. And we know from our sales activity study here at Forrester, and we talked about this, that only 25 to 30% of a seller's time is actually spent in direct selling activities. And in the future, sales in partnership with sales operations and revenue operations will spend the majority of their time actually extracting and analyzing information to help buyers and to help sellers know where to spend their time to be more productive.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple things earlier. One was around salespeople hate doing a lot of clicks.
Mhm.
Salespeople hate doing a lot of clicks, and salespeople also, or I shouldn't say sales, but I don't think anyone likes having multiple applications open, multiple windows open, and going from here to there to there to there. I think this is very much in line with technologies moving from solving a single pain point, right, and being best in class in solving a single pain point to moving into more of a platform play. And again, this is where we've spent a tremendous amount of time and energy at LeadIQ in not trying to create automation throughout the entire sales process. We are hyper focused on with our platform on creating efficiencies and automation on the front end on prospecting, right? So I think in terms of your sales organization really driving productivity, it's a lot of that's around how much can you automate? And again, as you mentioned earlier, how much can you automate in a manner that aligns to and anchors on your ideal sales process?
Yeah, and then all of these obviously lead to profitability and helping organizations become more profitable. And what we know that today, humans are really responsible for the majority of transactions, and that has a high cost of sales. And so in the future, what we're going to see is a strategic use of routes to market and resources and the tech stack, frankly, that will drive down that cost of sales, which will help us be more profitable as organization.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add to that in terms of driving down the cost of sales, you mentioned earlier that the decision-making process is now being heavily oriented towards finance, IT, and the executive team, right? And I think today, especially today, in light of a lot of the external market pressures, driving down cost of sales coinciding alongside budget consolidation is something that we all have to think about, right? As sellers, how is your solution achieving or fulfilling some of the strategic initiatives of not just IT or for depending upon what your solution is, the salesperson or the marketer, but how is it really helping the finance and the executive team who most likely are thinking about tool consolidation and driving down cost of sales?
Yeah, so those are the 5 Ps, and that's how we see the future. And we do believe this is a really exciting time to be in sales, a seller or a sales leader, sales operations, revenue operations, and marketing and customer success and sales and the revenue engine all really converging together to ultimately support the buyer and how they want to buy from us. And we have to match them where they are. We're going to get left behind.
Absolutely. Ben, Ann, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I learned a lot. Your experience is much appreciated. And for those of you watching, I hope you learned a lot too. If you would like a copy of the slides, or if you want to learn more about LeadIQ, you can use the QR code here to request that copy of the slides and also a demo of our product. I want to thank everyone for joining and happy prospecting.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.